Well, good morning, and to everyone that's here and to everyone that's streaming. I want to wish you a good morning as we cover this lecture and this workshop concerning grief counseling and all of the effects of grieving. We're going to deal with a lot of information for the next 2 to 3 hours to really cover the grieving process and dealing with. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for your insight. We thank you for your wisdom. We ask that you give us help, that you give us guidance and direction, that if we become efficient at the grieving process and helping others as they navigate through their pain, their affliction, and what they've been through. In Yeshua's name, amen. Marcus, will you make sure that everyone has one of these handouts, if you will? I'm going to make you the handout king, so there's some other people that may come in, so they'll have that handout. The grieving process is a very interesting process because everyone at one point in time in their life will experience the grieving process. They will experience death. Death is, the old saints said, they welcome it as an old friend. Although at one point in time in your life, you will be affected by the grieving process. But no two people, even though we're all made, respond to the process alike. However, there are characteristics of the symptoms of grieving that we'll cover, and the process in which people need to go through the grieving process to make it. And sometimes in the process, people get stuck on stages in the grieving process. And hopefully what we will discuss over the next few weeks is the whole piece of grieving, over the next few hours is the whole piece of grieving and how to make that process as easy as possible. We're going to go over some concepts that are widely used in grieving. Who are the experts in grieving? Being able to have efficient words to diagnose parts of the grieving process is paramount, that you understand where it is. Now, I know we're going to deal with grieving as it relates to death, but we also will deal with grieving versus relationships and divorce and separation. Those are all types of grieving process that lead people through those areas. You're going to have some terms that we're going to cover here in the grieving process. We're going to talk about the first stage of grieving is denial. The second form of grieving is anger. The third form of grieving is bargaining. Fourth is depression. Fifth is acceptance. You're going to hear me talk about those, but grief is not just when someone dies. People grieve when they're separated from their children. They grieve when they lose their company, when they lose their job. The grief process has been unfortunately relegated only to death. And so people go through these forms and helping them recognize each of these stages. Sometimes people get stuck on one or more of these stages in their development. And it's important that we help them as counselors and grief counselors to matriculate. The other thing that we'll deal with is the grief responsibility, what to say to people that's grieving, how to help them understand the grieving process, things you should say and things you shouldn't say, like they're going to a far better place, you'll see them again. That's an interesting term, and we're going to deal with stuff like that. Words that we've been taught over the years to say that necessarily is not healthy or helpful and add to the frustration. We're going to also deal with pieces that deal with in here of what is the church's responsibility for the grieving process and developing a grieving ministry. I'm going to share nuggets with pastors. This is one way to increase your congregation through the grieving process, and it is a great way to deplete your congregation through the grieving process, and how it can be used as an evangelical tool to win people to Christ and to strengthen your church, and what it can be done as a liability to your church. And so we've got a wealth of information. Sean, if you put our first point on the screen, if you will, help us go through this process. What is grief? Grief is a physical and emotional, somatic cognitive and spiritual response to the actual treatment of a loss of a person, things, place, or emotions that is attached. We grieve because we are biologically willing to attach. The grieving process can be mostly explained is a physical and emotional connection with thing, or the absence of it is what grief is. It is being able to function without the loss of something. Now, please understand that means that is the loss, dealing with the loss of something. And so we have a cognitive, and grief deals with cognition and what we believe is spirituality. There's a question, logically, can we handle the fact that we have been separated? One of the things in the stages of grieving we'll deal with is how that people will blame God and lose connection with God, because grieving is the process in which we're identifying with the loss of something. And that's why I said grieving does not necessarily have to be with death. Many times a divorce will create a grieving process. Now, the difference with death as it relates to divorce is that death can seem finite. But if a person experiences grieving from the standpoint of believing that relationships will never be restored, it's like death to them. Some people can feel like they've fallen, they've done good in the professional world, they've lost their job, and they'll never rebound to the place. They will go through these same symptoms of grief. And so when pastors start saying to me, oftentimes, that we got to work with the people and they need counseling, and many times they're going through the stages of grief. During the grieving process, alcohol addiction can be birthed. Several dysfunctional issues can be birthed through the grieving process. And so we want to be able to address it. Go to the next one, Precious. Common grief responses and feelings: numbness, shock, anger, anxiety, loneliness, fatigue, yearning, and relief. Let's go over that. These are typical emotions that people will go, and you'll get a chance because you're going to get a link to this additionally, so you'll get a chance to see some of this stuff. But they'll go through a numbness, shock, anger, anxiety, loneliness, fatigue. When a person is going through the grieving process, they can be always tired. They're always drained. Now watch this. Grieving does not have a set time of how long you should grieve. Now, family and churches and people say it's time to start living, get over it, get past it. You know, you're going to be okay, cheer up, come on, go hang out with me. The truth of the matter is that no one person deals with the grieving process like the next. So there have been people that go through the grieving process for months, others have gone through it for years. The grieving process. I mean, in a healthy setup, there have been people that have gone 24 months through the grieving process and are just now getting the grip of it. What we've learned is that it doesn't matter if you had a close relationship with the person in terms of whether you hated them or liked them. It could be an abusive father. It could be an abusive mother. You still go through part of the grieving process, even with people that you necessarily did not like, even though you may be glad they're gone out of your life. Caregivers are two things that go through the grieving process. It's real intense with caregivers because they have spent their time taking care of someone, helping them pass over, and then they grieve through the process of taking care of the person that they're with. And then after they die, they have an emptiness because they're so used to taking care of people that their life feels lost because they have displaced their lives for several months, several years, and they're having to learn how to live again. So they have a twofold experience, grief and displacement, because emotionally they're trying to get a grasp on whether they go from life there. And so they go through fatigue. Now, fatigue is another thing I want to talk to you about, is that oftentimes people who've gone through the grieving process, they almost seem lethargic. They have a desire to sleep, but sometimes they don't get any rest. They have trouble sleeping at night. But they're always tired even when they're resting, because part of the grieving process is chronic fatigue. They will suffer with that. And this is how you diagnose whether a person has been through the grieving process, because they'll tell you, I'm fine. Everything's okay. What we found is that people oftentimes that are the ones that go through the hardest time with the grieving process are family members that was in charge of all of the affairs. they're forced to be strong. They're forced to not release emotions. They're people that will cry a year later from the loss of persons, and so they have not come to the reckoning, or they've been forced to not deal with the emotional side. They've had to be business. I've got to get mother buried. I've got to handle this funeral. I've got to get my son buried. I've got to handle the affairs of my life. And so they're so busy handling the affairs that they have not accepted and gone through the matriculation process of death. It is just another deal that they're dealing with, and they will suppress those emotions and feelings, and unchecked feelings are like a beach ball. No matter how you push it down, it's going to come up somewhere else. And so oftentimes the matriarchs of the family, whoever that person is in charge of making sure everything flows, they have to be strong for the rest of the family. Mama D is in charge. Daryl, Uncle Dave is in charge. And so he's making sure everything is taken care of, and he hasn't had a moment to experience. Now, what I found out with working with couples and working with people that are going through the grieving process, one parent may break down and the other parent don't when losing a child. One finds himself in a cocoon because he has to be strong to handle the affairs. They've got to be in charge. Now, the challenge with that is that one person said, let it out, get it out, let it out. The truth of the matter is, many people that deal with the crying process and the acceptance of death initially tend to do better in many cases than people that are forced in positions to suppress. Now, remember now, Sean, put that back up on the screen again. Numbness, anger, loneliness, yearning, relief, fatigue, shock, anxiety. People after the death of someone will become altered, and they will not be the same any longer as we knew them when they're going through the grieving process. They're anxious. Sometimes they're cold. They'll be handling the arrangements and said, we're just going to do this, such and such. Well, who's going to get what? I don't care what you get. Let's just get through this. It's like they can go through a numbness. They don't feel anything. They don't hurt. They're not happy. They're not sad. They just got to deal with it and work through it. And the problem with this is that many times they will experience numbness beyond the funeral. Now, they will assume to come back to work. They'll start back to work. They'll start back to doing church stuff. They'll get active, but they won't be the same. They will go through, and they'll stay busy to keep their minds off of it, and they'll become active, but they won't be the same. Something changed in that person. They're not the same person as they have always been. Now, one of your jobs will be to recognize, especially in the parachurch and the church network, is to recognize altered personality patterns and to take an observation of altered personality patterns. Because when we see these kinds of things persist, they're only persisting because the person is still in the grieving process. Our job is to get them out of the grieving process. Because the longer they're there, the longer chances of emotional damage happens as long as they are there. Let's go to the next section. Um, these are physiological things that they'll experience that grief has on one's body. Tightness in the chest. That's why sometimes they don't know if they're having a heart attack or not. They have tightness of the chest. They oftentimes have shortness of breath, lack of energy, panic attack-like symptoms. Most people don't realize that people that have anxiety attacks, many times those anxiety attacks because they have still not dealt with the dying process. Now, some of these things, of course, are things that happen immediately after hearing about death. But many times these are characteristics that people, have you heard of people that have anxiety attacks, panic attacks? They just get frustrated and they don't understand. They just can't, they're driving and they just have to pull over to the side of the road because they go to shaking, and these are all symptoms of the grieving process that people have. A lack of energy. Sometimes they have shortness of breath. They'll be walking and they're breathing. Now watch this. There is no logical reason why they are having shortness of breath. There is no physiological reason that they are having panic attacks. There's nothing that should suggest, but the grieving process, grief is an emotion, and it has an effect on your body. If you don't believe me, watch your hypertension. If you have hypertension and you have a pain in your body, your blood pressure will go up. Pain is an emotion, and it will cause your physiological body to respond. And so a lot of times in churches, when you're examining people and they're having panic attacks and they're getting frustrated, and people are saying, just believe God. We're praying that God strengthen your emotions and everything. And the truth of the matter is, they're still going through. Sometimes you should ask, have you lost someone recently? Who have you lost in your life? People get antsy and very short in dealing with people. And you're thinking like, they're just mean. That's just how she is. Do you know that one of the cute signs, and we're going to deal with this, is that what messes people up with the grieving process is that people that have recently been through deaths oftentimes switch churches if they embrace God. And let me explain to you what that means. Okay, the significance of that. In the 21st century, we're noticing that when we build churches, we're recommending that the contractors are recommending that you build a sub-sanctuary inside the church, like a youth church inside it, a smaller chapel that'll sit at least 200 people. You build an 800-seat sanctuary, at least a 250 chapel inside of it, because the average funeral is 200 to 400 people. Some of those funerals that are people that are well known in the community. Now, occasionally they're larger. And you say, well, why would we build a 500-seat youth chapel inside? Because people don't return to church, the Bynum report says, after death. You say, well, that's something new. Well, actually it is. Typically, when I've got to come and look and see where mother has laid and sit there every Sunday, and I pass 5 of the good churches before I got to your church, I try to sit there, but I can't stand to sit there and see where mama went home. So I passed 5 of the churches. So you know what I'm going to do? Many times it's too much for me to bear. Watch this. Olden days, the church selection was limited. You always went to that church. You had no choice. People's occultish model concerning church meant that they went irregardless. They endured the pain. This is a generation that will take no pain. If they don't like it, if something discomforted them, they just don't do it. They just won't do it. So they recommend to pastors that while so many pastor churches are saying we don't do funerals in the sanctuary, main sanctuary, it's not because they're being nasty. Now, what churches' responses oftentimes is that they have a sub-sanctuary chapel, or they go to the chapel, the funeral chapel, and the church has a policy that they go in full regard. What we found is that even if you don't have it at the church, but the church shows up in full support, it has the same healing effect to people. So that means that there's a sub-choir that's assigned for funerals. There is a subgroup of ushers that are assigned that this month you're on funeral patrol, that you have officers that are assigned and they respond. So the person says, my church came around me even though it wasn't in the main sanctuary. Because people don't. Now watch this. Now if they don't return back and later they find new churches, that means, watch this, the new pastor has no clue on the pulse of the person he has inherited in his congregation. And so he assumes, because as long as he's known this person, they have been this way, that's how Miss Sister Jones acts. When in actuality, Sister Jones is 8 years in the grieving process and have not gotten past it. Okay. And if there's a question, you can always feel free to ask while I'm talking. I don't have a problem with that. So it's important, let me say this, it's important that when dealing with the grieving process that you're able to diagnose when you start seeing people that are anxiety, panic attacks, don't have many energy. Reb, I would come tonight, but I'd be just so tired. And you're like, you're 28 years old. You're 32 years old. Why? Come on to the next point. Let's move. How does grieving affect cognition, how you process? Disbelief, confusion, a sense of presence, lack of concentration. They can't get focus. You can tell people something and you keep having to repeat them to people. Did you hear what I said? They're always confused. You say something in training sessions or to people and they take it the wrong way every single time. And the frustrating is, that they have too much education to always get confused over things you say. And you're sitting back saying, I simply said this to this person, but they heard something else. I talk about the communication screen. In psychology, we deal with communication misnomers. I can tell you that we're clearing the building because we have an infestation of power surges. Or I can say today we have an infestation of people in the building. The term infestation is often used by rodents or things, so the connotation on the word infestation infers that we've got bad people, too many people in there, when the word infestation does not mean that. It just means filled. But its words are commonly used with things. But when it's told, it says, well, they got all kind of dirty people in that church, and the perception of what another person heard versus what you said is oftentimes different. And it's called a communication screen. Literally, Satan, he funnels or screens what you say out of your mouth, and the person on the other end heard one thing, but you said a completely different. And these are called communication screens. And so oftentimes, that's why we encourage people to have another proxy person that can hear. Or sometimes says, hey, I just want to record this for my own safety, not safety, but for my own confidence, because I like to refer back to the things I say. I oftentimes do that with leadership meetings, because they'll say, no, you didn't tell me to do that. You didn't say that. And I just smile and drop my head and said, okay. And I was like, well, let me let you listen to this. And it was like, oh, you did. In the grieving process, you want to know you want to know that cognition is affected. Disbelief, not only the dying process, but sometimes they go into the mode of not believing stuff. Faith is affected by the dying process sometimes. For some people, faith is encouraged, but sometimes faith is affected. They become very cynical of things. They're not optimistic. Optimism is affected in the grieving process. And so, because the last thing they hoped for didn't live. You say, well, does it really depends on how old the person is? Because if they were 80 years old, then they should have known that they were going to die. Well, that's not always true. Even though they know that life is going to end, they're still not prepared for it, because that person has become a fixture. And when fixtures are adjusted in their life, they go through trying to understand reality and trying to understand, how am I going to live? Because the fixtures in my life are no longer there. And so fixture management. Come on, let's go to the next one. Let's move. Common responses. Sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance, social withdrawal, dreams of the deceased, absent-minded behavior patterns. One of the things that they go through in the grieving process is they have sleep disorder. They have insomnia. When they finally get to sleep, they dream about the dead. They're still remembering mama. Mama came to them in a dream. Mama talked to them. Now, the truth of the matter is, I'm not going to say that spiritually this didn't happen. I have a balanced perspective, but actuality, the way the cognitive mind works, it's just your mind trying to flush your guilt. So mama did come in your room, and sometimes they will almost borderline hallucinate or be in trances, remembering things. Well, mama came to me and mama told me such and such. Chances are mama said nothing. Mama has not crossed the great beyond to come back and do. It's your mind flushing information. Now, I'm very spiritual. I believe in the gifts of the Spirit and God talking and all that. But in the grieving process,